Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Geoff Pallay, and thanks for being with us. Today we've got a special episode today. We're joined by two former Secretaries of State. We've got Kim Wyman from Washington State and Kathy Boockvar from Pennsylvania. We're going to talk all about elections, election policy, how our elections are administered, how we trust them, and basically how do we talk more about elections as Americans. So let's get into this episode. I'm really excited about it. So Kathy and Kim, let's get to it. Okay, I'm joined now by Kathy Boockvar and Kim Wyman. Kathy and Kim, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so you both have served as Secretaries of State. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to get together and start working together on this project. What's the story behind that? How did that materialize?
Yeah, it's a really good story. I'll start, and Kim, you jump in. Kim and I are very comfortable, interrupting each other, by the way, so it's all good.
Like a family.
Kim and I actually first bonded, really got to know each other in 2019 when we were on this incredible trip where Secretaries of State from across the country got together and took a tour, a civil rights tour of our voting rights history, the worst and the best of it, the most devastating and most inspiring aspects of it. We went to Alabama. We went to Birmingham and Montgomery and Selma. And Kim and I were two of the, 18 or 19 chief election officials who went together. And so Kim and I really got to know each other starting then. And then both lived through the very challenging years of the 2020 election cycle. And then, Kim, you want to tell sort of the second part of it?
Well, yes. And so coming out of the 2020 election, we were both invited to be part of the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. And we got to talking at one of our events where we were touring a center and really talking about the challenges of the extreme partisanship that we were both in the middle of. And that, many of our friends that we knew and people we knew were experiencing this, you're a Democrat, so I have to hate you sort of attitude. And I'm a proud Republican and I only talk to Republicans, and I'm a proud Democrat and I only talk to Democrats. And Kathy and I really started talking about how can we help bridge those gaps and remind, people around us that we're all Americans and that we have different points of view on how the country should run or how our individual state should run. But we've got to figure out a way to have those conversations, both making policy and just how we interact as people in this country. And I think that we really want to try to help heal from the kind of post-2020 events.
Yeah, it's very interesting stories and background there. So how would our listeners understand in sort of a straightforward way, what does the Secretary of State do to oversee elections? Everyone, you go to the polls, you vote for a Secretary of State, or maybe you vote for governor who appoints a Secretary of State. And, the average voter hears and knows what the position is. What does that actually look like? How can you describe it, maybe a story or something like that? Like, what does it look like on the ground right now for the next few weeks for those who currently are Secretaries of State?
Well, I'll start. In elections, really, each state has the authority to define how elections are run in their state by the U.S. Constitution. And so it depends by state, whether it's the Secretary of State, it might be an election board, or it might be the lieutenant governor who oversees elections. But the actual conduct of elections happens at the local level. And that, again, varies by state. It may be at the county level, it may be at a municipal or even a township level. Kathy?
Yeah. So, I think, Geoff, most Americans don't realize how decentralized our elections are in this country, to Kim's point. And so we actually have over 9,000 election jurisdictions in this country. And I'm not exaggerating, 9,000. And so in Pennsylvania, it's a county-based system. We have 67 counties. So basically 67 elections are run by each county. There are, federal laws, of course, that govern everyone. There's state laws that govern everyone, but a lot of the day-to-day decisions are made at the local level on the canvassing and the ballot, casting the ballots. So I used to joke that as Secretary of State, I was mathematician in chief, because each of the 67 counties would, run their own elections, count their ballots, certify them to me, and we would add them together. And of course, we would also make sure that the federal laws and the state laws were being followed and that audits were being performed, appropriately, and all the things that go into that. But really, it's a partnership. It's a partnership between the Secretary of State and each of those local election officials, which, I mentioned in Pennsylvania, it's 67 counties, but in some states like Wisconsin, they have 1,900 election jurisdictions. In Michigan, it's 1,600. In Maine, it's 500. So it's very decentralized, and that's why it's so key that the Secretary of State and the local election officials really work together to ensure the most secure and accurate elections.
Yeah,
I'd also just add
this episode. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kim.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just one thing I think was to kind of tie up what Kathy was saying is that the state legislatures are the ones who actually set election law for their state. But oftentimes, again, depending on the state, the chief election official or election board has rulemaking authority. And this is, of course, coming into play, I think, as we're going into 2024 in the last couple of weeks. That rulemaking authority is that ability to get into the weeds and tell local officials how they are going to conduct the election at that very basic level of, how you're physically counting the ballots. So rulemaking authority is really important too. And again, many chief election officials in states have that ability to set those rules.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One thing we've talked about in the show in the past is the number of elected officials in the country, which, of course, is not a perfectly accurate number. Let's just call it 585,000 elected officials, which is a much larger number than we find most average readers and listeners realize. Most people think about, okay, well, Congress and state legislatures, that's just 12,000 of the elected officials. The vast majority of our elections are all super local, very small districts, and to your point, Kathy and Kim, in the very decentralized election system. So both of you are not Secretary of State anymore. What do you miss about that? Is there anything in particular that you miss about your time overseeing elections?
I'll start. The team that we had, and many of whom are still in the Department of State, but many have gone on to other things. The team was so connected and supportive, and great senses of humor, which all of this was so critical during the very intense and challenging circumstances leading up to, during, and following the 2020 election. And so to have the privilege of working with just the incredible election officials at every level in Pennsylvania and across the country as Secretary of State was the privilege of my lifetime. And I'm so glad to still be doing election security work at the national level. But there's something about being in the bunker with your team really day in and day out that I do miss.
Yeah.
Oh, absolute ditto. I miss that connection with people, but I think it's the work. And there is a synergy that comes from not only your immediate group that you work with, but the statewide team that you have. And then, as Kathy said, across the country, there is a connection that the work makes for people that are election administrators that is very unique. And I think is what keeps people in the profession. When you think about what election officials have endured over the last 4 years, the attacks, the threats of violence, the death threats, the people saying that you're a traitor because you rigged the election or that you're incompetent in the way you do your work. Those things are really hard after a while to take, and that constant barrage has taken a toll on many election officials. But what I see now as we're about to go into, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have an end of this election cycle and begin to canvass it. What I see is that people are proud of the work they do. And more importantly, they understand what they're doing, that they are really helping determine who is going to lead this country, who is going to lead individual states and our communities. And, it is the foundation. The elections are the foundation of our representative democracy. And I don't know an election official who does this work that ever loses sight of that.
Yeah. Was compliance, to kind of go back to your prior comments about the local level, was compliance or accountability, was that ever an interesting challenge where you're trying to set some policy or some rule from the state, whether it's rulemaking out of the Secretary of State's office or just trying to enforce a law passed by the legislature in that really decentralized system? I imagine there could be challenges with getting 100% compliance on that. And that's not for any nefarious means. It's just because it's hard in any profession, in any business. So what does that look like from your experience? Any interesting stories come out of that?
Oh boy, how
Are you
much
talking
time
about-
do we have?
Is that really?
As much time as Frank lets it roll.
Oh, I was going to say, you're talking about compliance like within the individual counties or municipalities.
Yeah.
I think for most election officials, it's always top of mind. And remember, elections fall in the executive branch of the three branches of government, and they don't make the laws. They just have to follow them. And it's not lost, again, on any election official that that's their role. And with that said, I don't think you really pay attention to it as an election official until you go through a high-profile or close contested election. And particularly if that election crosses county lines, so it may be a legislative district or congressional race or a statewide race. And we saw that certainly in 2020, where you had people who were in states and really comparing how one county was handling ballots to another county. And when you go through that experience at the local level, it changes your view of the importance of following everything in a consistent way. And I think that was really the role of those state chief election officials, is trying to get their independently elected, oftentimes, local officials to all do things in a consistent manner. So when that election that's being contested happens, they can look at county to county to county and know that each voter was treated exactly the same. And that's really the goal, I think, of election officials in the modern era.
Yeah, I mean, and these things are challenging even under the best of circumstances. But in Pennsylvania, we had the confluence of more challenges and more changes than we've seen basically in a century in Pennsylvania. And so when I first started in the Department of State in 2018, the first thing we did was we mandated that all counties in Pennsylvania upgrade their voting systems to new voter verifiable paper trail and auditable paper trail voting systems, and meaning new security standards, because the voting systems that were being used in Pennsylvania predated the first iPhone. I mean, they were old. So we mandated that, and we thought that was going to be the biggest challenge we were going to face during our administration. And then the next year after that, the legislature passed Act 77 of 2019. It was signed into law October 31st, 2019, making more changes to how elections are run and how voters vote in Pennsylvania than any law passed in Pennsylvania in over 80 years, to take effect at the primary of 2020, right, of a major presidential year. So it's signed into law October 31st. It's supposed to take effect 6 months later. That was before. That gives every Pennsylvanian the right to vote by mail with no excuse. That's before anybody had ever heard the term COVID-19, right? So then 4 months later, we're in the middle of global pandemic. And so to your point, like even in the best circumstances, having a decentralized system, again, like 67 counties seemed like challenging until I learned of the 1900 in Wisconsin and 1600 in Michigan. It's a very challenging thing to oversee a large number of disparate election systems. But when you're in the middle of a crisis or you're implementing a brand new law, or in this case, it was many, laws that were taking effect all at the same time. And then, of course, we also had civil unrest, following the police shooting in Minneapolis, in major cities, cities across the country. So it was incredibly challenging to make sure that we provided as uniform as possible, but also, more importantly, a safe and secure ability for people to come out and vote. And what we saw was again and again and again across the country, we had record voter participation in 2020 than we've ever seen in history. And that is thanks to the incredible dedication and hard work of our election officials at every level.
Yeah. Hell, very interesting. So what are some common questions you get about the electoral system? I mean, I know what questions we get at Ballotpedia here from readers and listeners, but I'm curious, when you're traveling or when you're talking to voters or groups, are there particular common questions that you think, okay, yeah, this is what people typically ask, and this is what we're usually sort of answering for folks? So what comes to mind there?
Oh, there's always questions. I think that 2020 put it front and center for the average voter, and I think the most common question really is, how do you make sure that people aren't voting more than once if they have a absentee ballot and they show up on election day to vote? And I think the easiest way to explain it, sort of globally, is first and foremost, elections are run at that local level. So we have, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 jurisdictions who are responsible for not only getting ballots and the correct ballot to voters, but accounting for those ballots when they come back and reporting those results in the manner that reflect the way people cast their ballots. And I think the easiest analogy is how banks control your money and account for your money. How as an individual person right now, do you know that you have money in your bank account and how much that is? All of those checks and balances that a bank uses to physically count the cash in their vault, to looking at the ledgers in their computers to make sure that every penny is accounted for. I think that those same techniques of dual control environments and checking the electronic totals against the physical paper ballots counted in a precinct, for example, are all techniques to account for ballots, to account for how people voted, and really making sure that it is eligible voters who are on the voter registration rolls who are actually casting those votes that are counted and reported. Kathy?
Yeah, I think, all that, I agree. Similar questions. I think, it's an unfortunate circumstance. You could tell what news programs people watch by the kinds of questions they ask these days. And not that that's new, but I would say it's sort of more than ever. So, I find, if somebody's asking, say, about, I don't know, Project 2025 or something, they're generally watching MSNBC. And if they're asking about like alleged conspiracy theories or alleged double voting or fraud or what happened, or 2020 allegations, they're watching Fox. And it's frustrating because both the left and the right TV programs are reinforcing the echo chamber that most people are putting themselves in right now. And really, it would be best for people to be reading a broad swath of news and information. And it's not just, I don't mean to diss MSNBC and Fox, because it's really like these things are, just as are more at fault, right? With the 24/7, 365, information cycle that we have attached to our hips at all times. So I would say I get questions both at the most detailed and at the broadest level. So like in 2020, I was actually surprised by how many people who had heard that there was litigation over signature checking. I was surprised about how many individual voters would say things to me like, how do my signature, particularly if they were older voters, would say, my signature has changed so much over the years. How do I keep my ballot from being rejected because my signature looks different than it did when I registered to vote 30 years ago? So that's kind of like the most minute detail, right? But then I also still get questions like, what happened in 2020? Like, you hear all these things, and can you explain to me, like, in a really broad way, like, how do we make sense of these conspiracy theories? How do I know where to check my information? And so, it's one of the areas where we still have so much work to do, because the conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. But, Kim and I and other election officials, we not so jokingly refer to ourselves as election nerds, because we could spend hours talking about all the layers of security and integrity that go into every step of the process. But Americans, well, not just Americans, like global citizens, they want 45-second answers, and we haven't figured out, for the most part, how to do it as well in those 45-second chunks.
Well, if you're electioneer, you're in the right place, because we say that a lot here at Ballotpedia as well, and we totally understand where you're coming from there. You kind of foreshadowed a little bit my next question, which is, so the left has their lingo, the right has their lingo. They're kind of speaking different languages in some cases. What is the recipe to at least the one that you think might work? Because maybe we probably haven't invented it yet, or else maybe it would be in use. But what's the recipe to speak across the spectrum to both party bases and to sort of find some common ground? Is there a way to bridge that divide? What do you find is helpful when you engage in those situations?
Go ahead, Kathy.
All right. So, this is something that, Kim and I spent a lot of time talking about, because again, people aren't even trying these days. It's like people are not talking to each other, and it's very frustrating. So, I think, some of what we need to be doing is just raising the base level of understanding that Americans have about how elections are run in this country, because the more people know going in, the less susceptible they are to the lies and conspiracy theories. And so, but we in this country don't have a well-developed whole of society approach to reaching people where they are, right? Getting accurate information to people in simple, understandable ways. And so Kim's heard me tell this story a million times. Like I was on a flight to Salt Lake City a couple of years ago, and the woman sitting next to me wanted to chat, and she asked me why I was going to Salt Lake City. And I told her that I was going for work, and she understood that I was in election security. And when she heard that, she immediately was like, what happened? Like, can you tell me how this works? And she clearly, all I knew about her is that she was going home to Salt Lake City. And later I found out she was a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And she said, you hear so much. And so we spent most of the flight talking, where I literally was telling her about, I talk about the people, the science, and the math of how elections are run. And she kept asking more questions and learning about just the basics of how secure our elections are. And we got to the end, she said, she was so relieved, Jeff. And she was like, she said, you hear so much of this other stuff. She's like, and that was so helpful, everything you just told me. And she said, I would love to share all that information with my neighbors and my family and my church mates, but I don't have the words. If you could give me the words, I would be able to be an ambassador in my own community. And so that Kim and I, that was part of Kim and my talking about, we need together to be talking to the right and the left and the middle, giving them the words to be able to be ambassadors in their own communities.
Well, I'm glad Kathy told that story, because that was really what started our conversations in this realm, because I had a similar experience coming out of 2020 where I was visiting with some of my parents' friends in a very small part of eastern Idaho. And we were having a discussion that lasted a couple hours. And it began with, I know the election was rigged, and there's nothing you can tell me that will convince me otherwise. And so we sat around this, this bar and had a conversation. And I think the only reason they listened to me in the beginning was because I was a Republican Secretary of State. And by the end, I don't think I changed any of their beliefs about specific elements of the election, particularly about other states, but they were willing to listen. And that's, I think, where Kathy and I really connected, is this idea of it's both, the listening and the conversation, and they go hand in hand. And I work with the Bipartisan Policy Center as a senior fellow, and they've done some research that really talks about how Americans are getting their information about elections. And one thing that I know we know is that people have a higher trust level of their local election official. When you ask them whether they believe their ballot was counted accurately, people are at very high rates think that that's true. And the further that gets away from them, so when we start talking about other states or on a national scale, that confidence goes down. And so we know that some of this is from the coordinated campaign to, really try to undermine people's confidence and trust in U.S. elections. And so the good news out of all of this is that most Americans do have confidence in their votes being counted accurately. And so we also know that out of the study that most Americans learn about elections from television and social media when it comes to sources of information. So I think to kind of answer your question, part of this goes back to starting with your local election office. If you have questions about how elections are run, start there. And that's where people trust it the most. And, really trying to get people to get out of their bubbles and at least listen and have those conversations, because our country is really important, and that's what unifies us. We're all Americans. So let's start there and then work together to try to move forward.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Geoff, can I just add one thing, which is one of the initiatives that I think has been great and we should see more of is called Disagree Better by the National Governors Association. And there's been more election-specific versions of it where you have somebody on the right and somebody on the left saying basically, we disagree on pretty much everything. But what we agree on is that our elections are conducted safely, securely, and accurately. And because it's actually, though there has been this clearly coordinated campaign to tear down faith in our democracy, it actually hurts us all. It hurts us all. Kim and I can talk, about how disinformation and these fake sites and conspiracy theories have evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of it used to be almost entirely coming from our overseas adversaries, and a lot of it still is. But what sort of started to shift in 2020 was that instead of it just being almost entirely from overseas, it started being our own domestic actors intentionally tearing down faith in our democracy, in our electoral processes, and intentionally fueling this American against American divide. And so, frankly, this is why this is a national security issue. It's a global security issue. This is happening in nations all over the globe. And when we do it to ourselves, when our leaders are tearing down faith in each other and fueling American against American divides, we are doing the dirty work for our foreign overseas adversaries. They are laughing at us because they don't have to work as hard when we're doing their work for them. So it's really, it's such a serious issue for our nation, which is why, I think Kim and I really want every every party, every candidate, every elected or appointed official to be lowering the temperature of everyone. Like, we need to all agree that when our person loses, that happens. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but our elections are secure and accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. One last question for you both. 10, 20 years from now, where do you see the election sort of industry headed? Do voting procedures, advancements in election security and technology, just, you've been around this for a really long time, take us down the road. Where do you see things headed?
Oh, I think technology is always going to be a critical part of elections. It has been for the last 30 years, at least of my career. And that's not going to stop. I think we will always have a paper element to it, as much as people will talk about internet voting or using your phone to cast a ballot, because you do it for every other part of your life. I think that at the end of the day, when you have a contested election and you're arguing about who won, there's something about holding it in your hand, holding that ballot that the voter marked. So with that said, I think we're going to see innovation in technology that will help facilitate that. We're going to need to figure out how to replace voting equipment, because across the country right now, as we sit here today, we're using some dated technology, shall we say, and the threats from cyber criminals, foreign nation-state actors, and just generally people that like to mess with technology, that's not going to stop. And so we really need to continue to secure our nation's election system in all of those jurisdictions, and work together to keep it going. And I think in the future, we're going to have similar conversations 20 years from now. Maybe not we are going to have them, but someone is going to have similar conversations, because these are conversations we had 20 years ago when Gore v. Bush was top of mind and the country was a little divided then too.
Yeah, Kim and I are going to be like with our walkers, like hobbling in. I think we're still going to be
in
here.
2020.
Yeah, I'm going to use this opportunity, Geoff, to actually say this question is a really good reason why we need to have better funding of elections in this country. So we talked about the decentralization of elections. Part of that also has historically meant that our funding is decentralized, which means historically in Pennsylvania, it was a county by county funding, decision about how. So if your county prioritized state of the art things for elections, you would have more funding than if your county didn't. And it's crazy that we have federal elections, right? And yet we have no built-in expected funding from the federal government of our elections, even our federal elections. So what's happened over the last 5 to 7 years, there have been these periodic HAVA grants where all of a sudden sort of the federal government has given some money, but you don't know it's coming. So election officials who should be running their election offices like a business, right? So a business, you're going to assess, what years you got your printers, what years you got your computers and your photocopy machines, so that you can figure out, okay, I need to replace this in 3 years and replace that in 5 years and up my cybersecurity protections. And we don't have that benefit in elections. It's really very unfortunate. So we need sustained, every year, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for across the country from the federal government as well as state funding. And with that, I think, to Kim's point about the paper, I told you that one of the first things I did when I started in the Department of State was to mandate these paper trail voting systems, and I used to joke that these new systems had the perfect marriage. They have the balance of the tangible paper that you could audit, combined with the best of security in the tabulation and the scanners and all that stuff. And so I think we'll continue to see variations on this, to Kim's point. I agree that particularly looking at where we are with this distrust in elections, we need the ability to have the paper trail so that we can audit in and go back and look at it. But Americans are also very much addicted to speed of knowing their election results, which Kim and I, could spend hours just on that issue. But it's that, so whatever forms of technology we see ourselves in 10 years and 20 years, I do think having that balance, that balance of the tangible paper with the most secure and advanced technology is really the key.
Yeah. Well, Kim and Kathy, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for your very interesting insights about how the election system works in our country. And we're only a few weeks away from the election. So appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week and a lot more in the next couple of weeks as we make the final sprint toward the election. So make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Geoff Pallay, and thanks for listening.